police chief was driving alone through the stormy mountain roads of Ashwood Ridge when the crash came. Metal screamed, flames rose, and everyone thought it was over for Chief Raymond Blake. But out of the darkness, through smoke and snow, came a lone German shepherd with fire in his eyes. Max, what this dog did that night wasn't just rescue, it was a warning, because someone wanted the chief dead. And Max? He wasn't going to let that happen. What happened next will break your heart and restore your faith in second chances. Before we dive in, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe every animal deserves not just a home, but a purpose, hit that subscribe button. Because this story, this bond, might just change how you see loyalty forever. Ashwood Ridge was not known for violence nor mystery. Tucked between the low mountains of southern Wyoming and the edge of long-forgotten railroad tracks, the town often felt paused in time, its people modest, its air clean, and its winters always a few degrees harsher than expected. Tonight, however, winter wasn't gentle. Rain had turned to sleet by 7:40 p.m., and now, well past 9, freezing winds slashed through the pine-covered hills. Highway 67 shimmered with black ice, quiet, save for the whispering howl of the wind and the occasional passing rig groaning under the weight of cold steel and diesel. Chief Raymond Blake drove alone, one hand on the wheel of his Ford Interceptor, the other resting over a worn leather folder on the passenger seat. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with short-cropped silver hair and sharp blue eyes dulled slightly by years of loss. His once proud posture had settled into a stoic fatigue worn by both the job and the silence of a home that hadn't known laughter since his wife Camille passed from cancer 3 winters ago. The message that brought him out tonight had come through the department's encrypted internal line. A strange blip. A system-triggered flag showed unauthorized access to a records facility. Archive Building B2, just outside town. It could have been a system error, but something about the timestamp 3:03 a.m. the previous night felt wrong, and Raymond trusted his gut more than any automated log. The sleet pelted the windshield harder now, visibility thinning. He turned the defroster up. Then, in a blink, everything changed. A flash of white headlights in his side mirror. A roar, the crunch of impact. The black pickup came out of nowhere, swerving from behind, ramming into the rear quarter of his cruiser with brutal force. Tires lost grip. Metal groaned. Glass exploded. The Interceptor spun violently, skidding across ice and mud before vaulting over the guardrail. Trees blurred. Then darkness took him. Moments passed. Or maybe minutes. Time had no shape anymore. The world outside the wreck was silent until it wasn't. From the underbrush, out of shadows and freezing rain, came Max. He was 5 years old, a black and tan German shepherd with large paws, scarred forelegs, and ears always perked, like twin sentinels never off duty. Once a promising K-9 trainee, Max had been dismissed from his police unit in Denver for being over-instinctive and too emotionally reactive. What the reports failed to see was the raw, feral intelligence behind his eyes and a loyalty born of trauma. Max had spent the last 6 months roaming the forests around Ashwood Ridge, scavenging near the ranger stations, occasionally seen sleeping beside the abandoned sawmill. Locals called him Ghost Dog, believing he'd once belonged to a firefighter who died in a blaze. No one had claimed him. No one had dared. But tonight, something pulled Max from the trees. Maybe it was the shriek of metal. Maybe the scent of blood on freezing wind. Maybe destiny had teeth. He found the wreck quickly. The cruiser lay at a harsh angle, steam hissing from its hood. Fire flickered along the undercarriage. Gasoline trickled from the ruptured tank. Max leapt down the muddy slope, paws slipping but never slowing. His ears twitched at the sound of labored breathing. The scent familiar, layered with cold sweat and copper, was alive. Blake. Smoke curled around broken windows. Max pounced onto the hood, muzzle pressed to the shattered glass. Chief Blake was slumped forward, face bloodied, seatbelt still locked. The flames were growing now, licking the door frames. Max circled once, then launched himself at the shattered side window. Glass cracked. A second strike he dove through. Inside, the air was thick. Blake's eyes fluttered but stayed shut. Max whined low, pawed at the man's chest, then yanked at the collar of his jacket with sharp, deliberate bites. The scent of burning cloth singed his nostrils. Outside, somewhere in the hills, a siren wailed in the distance, too far. Max braced himself against the passenger seat, pulled once more. The seatbelt snapped loose. Blake collapsed sideways. Max gripped his coat collar and dragged inch by inch through the fractured door, down the cold slope, until they were clear of the heat. 17 minutes passed before emergency crews arrived. By then, Max had curled protectively over Blake's chest, growling at anyone who came too close, even medics. It took a veterinarian with gentle hands and a warm blanket to coax him aside. Blake, unconscious but breathing, was taken to Ashwood Memorial Hospital. Max was taken to the local animal shelter, temporarily. Far across town, inside a dim office at Ashwood Ridge Town Hall, Deputy Nora Grant sat before her monitor. Mid-30s, wiry but strong, she had auburn hair always tied into a no-nonsense braid and a face that smiled less and listened more. She'd been working with the force for 7 years, and something about her didn't let go of details easily. And right now, those details were screaming at her. The dispatch records for Engine 4, assigned to that sector, showed they were rerouted at 9:07 p.m., exactly 2 minutes after the chief's vehicle was struck. She narrowed her eyes. That wasn't a coincidence. And if there was one thing Nora Grant knew, it was this. Ashwood Ridge had just stopped being quiet. Raymond Blake awoke to the sound of rain tapping gently against the window. The sterile white ceiling above him shimmered with the soft flicker of fluorescent lights. He blinked slowly, his body aching like it had been run through a threshing machine. Every breath was a reminder of cracked ribs, a stitched brow, and bruises that bloomed in shades he couldn't name. The steady beep of the heart monitor echoed like a metronome beside him. A nurse stood at the foot of the bed, clipboard in hand. She was in her mid-40s, tall and narrow-shouldered, with short, peppered hair tucked behind one ear. Her name badge read Linda Zhao. Her expression was professional, but there was something maternal in the way she softened her tone. "You've got a stubborn guardian," she said, checking the IV line. "Hasn't moved since they brought you in." Blake furrowed his brow. "Who?" She tilted her head toward the hallway. "Big dog. German Shepherd. Animal Control tried to take him in. He snapped at everyone who got too close to your stretcher. Finally settled outside the hospital entrance. Just waiting." Blake's mind flickered with images, the crash, the heat, the smoke, then the eyes, sharp, wild, loyal. "Max?" he whispered. Zhao smiled faintly. "So, he's yours?" "No," Blake said, sitting up slightly with a wince, "but he saved my life." Later that morning, bundled in a coat and painkillers, Blake stepped through the hospital's automatic doors with Nurse Zhao at his side. The wind cut sharp, and rain had turned to flurries, dusting the concrete with white. Max sat by the corner post, tail curled around his legs, fur damp from the night's weather. He was alert, but still, eyes fixed on the door like he knew the world might come through it. The left ear twitched as Blake approached. Then Max stood, stiff-legged, proud. Blake paused a few feet away. "You waited." Max didn't move. He just watched. Cautious, as if reading the man for signs of weakness or threat. Blake crouched, groaning through the pain. "I guess you're not much for thank yous, huh?" A moment passed. Then Max stepped forward and pressed his forehead gently into Blake's knee. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't obedience. It was something else recognition. A warrior acknowledging another who'd bled beside him. "I don't know where you came from," Blake murmured, fingers brushing the thick fur behind Max's ears, "but I think you've earned a warm place to sleep." They returned to Blake's modest home just beyond the town's edge, nestled beneath the slope of Miller's Hill. The place was simple. Wood-paneled walls, a fireplace barely used, and a framed photo of Camille on the mantel, smiling in her park ranger uniform. Max explored cautiously, tail neutral, nose sweeping low along the floorboards. Blake set a bowl of water and some leftover roast in a tin dish. Max didn't eat right away. Instead, he wandered to the back door, sat, and stared out into the wind-blown yard. There was a scar beneath Max's left eye, faded but jagged. Blake noticed it as he passed by to shut the door. Then he spotted something else, an old bite mark near Max's ear, ragged and healed. "You've seen hell, too," he muttered. That night, Blake dreamed. He stood once again on the edge of Highway 67. The wind was howling, snow swirling in white sheets across the blacktop. His cruiser was nowhere in sight, just silence. And a figure. It stood at the shoulder of the road, a man-shaped blur, backlit by distant headlights, unmoving. There was something chillingly deliberate about its presence. Blake woke with a start, heart racing. He turned to see Max curled at the foot of the bed, head resting on his paws, eyes half open but alert. Watching. Meanwhile, at the Ashwood Ridge Police Department, Deputy Nora Grant stared at her screen. Late 30s with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, she had the look of someone who asked questions for sport and didn't blink at confrontation. Tonight, though, her expression was tighter than usual. She pulled up the timestamp from the regional toll booth camera near Highway 67. Nothing unusual, but something nagged her. She rewound 10 minutes, then 20. Static. Every other feed from that highway junction worked. Traffic, weather, construction. But that one camera went black from 8:42 p.m. to 9:17 p.m. The same window as Blake's crash. Someone had erased the footage. Nora leaned back in her chair, frowning. You don't tamper with a toll booth camera unless you've got something to hide. She reached for her phone, tapped into the internal server, and flagged the missing footage to her investigation queue. She didn't know what was going on yet, but one thing was clear. The crash that almost killed her boss wasn't just a random accident. Back at Blake's home, the fireplace crackled for the first time in months. Max lay on the rug, breathing slow and steady, ears twitching at every distant noise. Blake sat nearby, holding Camille's old field journal in one hand and a glass of bourbon in the other. "Tomorrow," he said aloud, not looking at the dog, "we start figuring out what the hell this was all about." Max didn't respond. He didn't need to. The frost still lingered on the grass by mid-morning, reluctant to release its hold on Ashwood Ridge. Mist drifted across the tree line like forgotten breath, clinging to rooftops and fence posts, giving the small town a ghostly quiet. Chief Blake stood outside his cabin, hands wrapped around a chipped black thermos of coffee, eyes narrowing against the pale sunlight. Max sat beside him, alert but relaxed, his broad chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. It had been 3 days since the crash. The bruises on Blake's ribs throbbed less now, but the questions hadn't faded. If anything, they'd multiplied. Max's ears twitched suddenly. His head turned, nose lifting into the air. Blake followed his gaze toward the ridgeline where a faint path wound through the woods. "Something out there?" he asked. Max didn't bark, didn't move, but his body tensed. That was answer enough. They drove north out of town, toward an old maintenance road once used by rail crews but now mostly forgotten. The gravel crackled beneath the cruiser's tires, the pine trees pressed in tight, their shadows deepening as the road narrowed. Eventually, Blake stopped the vehicle and stepped out, Max jumping down beside him with the fluid grace of an animal in his element. "Let's see what you found, partner," Blake murmured. Max took point, tail up, nose low. They moved into the woods, crossing uneven terrain until they reached a chain-link fence half buried in undergrowth. Beyond it, surrounded by creeping vines and rusted drums, stood an old warehouse with its side panels warped and weather-beaten. It hadn't seen use in decades, but the lock on the gate was new. Blake pushed the gate open with a grunt and stepped inside. Max followed close. The warehouse smelled of damp wood, mildew, and dust disturbed by rodents, but beneath it all, paper, stale ink, old documents. Blake's eyes swept the room. In the far corner sat several stacked filing cabinets, partially hidden by a tarp. Max moved toward them, sniffed once, then suddenly began pawing at a nearby stack of boxes. Hard. Easy, Blake warned, approaching, but Max wouldn't stop. His claws ripped through the top box. Papers spilled out, contracts, envelopes, carbon copies faded to gray. Blake knelt down and picked up a manila folder. His name was on it. So was his signature, except it wasn't his. The document was a purchase agreement, selling a tract of town-owned land near the lakefront to a private investor named Red Willow Properties. Blake frowned. He had never seen this contract. Yet the signature matched his exactly. He flipped through more pages. They were all the same legal sales, approvals, transfers, each bearing his name. Max growled low in his throat, drawing Blake's attention. The dog had nudged another box open with his nose. From it, a photograph had fallen. Blake picked it up slowly. It was a glossy 5x7. Victor Hale tall, lean, always dressed like he'd walked off a mayoral campaign poster, stood beside two other men in business suits. One of them, Blake recognized as Dennis Fuller, a construction magnate who had mysteriously retired early after a federal audit. The other, Jerome Beckett, had been declared missing last year after his sailboat disappeared during a storm. The three men smiled in the photo, standing in front of a banner that read Ashwood Development Initiative. Blake's pulse quickened. This was no coincidence. Meanwhile, Max growled again and turned toward a corner of the warehouse where a pile of sealed cardboard boxes leaned precariously. He began scratching aggressively at one stack until Blake helped move it aside. Inside was another cash thinner files labeled in Sharpie. Public projects, bids, contracts. One folder caught Blake's eye. Ashwood Ridge Land Rezoning 2020. He flipped it open. Tucked inside was a contract of sale for a large wooded section of protected land now listed as pending commercial clearance. His forged signature sat neatly at the bottom of the approval page. Blake exhaled sharply. "They're trying to bury me." Max huffed beside him, then sat with a low whine. The warehouse suddenly felt colder. At Ashwood Ridge Police Department, Deputy Nora Grant leaned over her desk, scanning through records. Her usually tidy desk was now cluttered with sticky notes and printed receipts. She had found something. A series of shell company invoices tied to road repairs that had never been completed. Her fingers paused over one name. Ardent Group. She dug deeper. Ardent Group was listed as a project facilitator for city infrastructure initiatives, yet had no local office, no active employees, and a website that redirected to a broken URL. On a hunch, she pulled the financial authorization forms for the last 3 years. Nearly every document bore either the mayor's or Victor Hale's countersignature, and once, just once Blake's, only it wasn't his. "Someone's laundering through public contracts," she muttered. She opened her email and drafted a note. Subject: Possible financial misconduct. Request access to archived permits. To Regional Auditor's Office. From Deputy Nora Grant. Attached: Summary of irregularities, signed documents, and flagged vendor records. She hit send. Back in the warehouse, Blake gathered as many documents as he could into an empty duffel bag found in a corner. Max stayed close, ears swiveling, posture tense. As they exited, Blake took one last glance back at the dark space that had held his forged downfall. He turned to Max. "You were right to bring me here." Max's tail gave a faint wag. They drove back to town under a sky now dull and overcast. The evidence rattled quietly in the trunk. Blake didn't speak for most of the ride. His mind was turning over the facts, fitting pieces together. Someone had used his name to authorize the selling off of town land. Someone had deliberately forged his signature. and someone had sent a truck to end him before he could find this place. Now, Blake had proof, and Max, he had purpose. The sun was dipping low when Blake and Max loaded the duffel bag full of documents into the back of the cruiser. The warehouse behind them stood quiet once again, cloaked in rust and shadows. The drive back was silent. Blake's mind churned, haunted by the image of his forged signature legal bindings tied to lies he never touched. They hadn't gone more than 2 miles down the gravel road when Max sat up suddenly in the back seat, ears perked, gaze locked through the rear window. Blake checked the mirror. A black SUV was trailing them, no headlights, tucked behind the curve of the trees like a ghost. "Damn it," Blake muttered. He tapped the brakes once. The SUV matched him, slowing. Then it accelerated, rapidly closing the gap. Max barked once, sharp and warning. Blake veered off the road, turning sharply onto a narrow service trail he hadn't used in over a decade. The SUV followed. They were being hunted. The cruiser thumped over roots and rocks, mud splashing along the wheel wells. "Hang on," Blake hissed, gripping the wheel tight. Max braced himself, body low and steady like he'd done this before. They swerved past a fallen log, branches slapping the windshield, before the trail thinned too narrow for a vehicle. Blake slammed the brakes. "Out! Go!" The door flung open. Max leapt out first, Blake right behind with the duffel flung over his shoulder. They dove into the pines just as the SUV crashed to a stop behind them, doors flying open. Footsteps thundered behind. 2 men, lean, quick, dressed in black tactical jackets, moved with grim precision. One had a shotgun, the other a pistol. Their faces were shadowed by hoods and beards, but they moved like men who had done this before. Blake recognized the walk. Former military, maybe private contractors. He gritted his teeth. His side ached from the movement, but he kept up. Max weaved beside him like a shadow, occasionally glancing back and growling low. The trail twisted toward an overgrown ravine. Blake recognized it. He'd trained there in his youth. Long summer runs, weighted backpacks, survival drills under a younger sky. "Left," he whispered. Max darted ahead, leading them through a narrow rock passage cloaked in thick pine. Behind, a shot rang out. Bark exploded from a nearby trunk. "They're not here to scare us," Blake muttered. Max darted into a tight crevice in the hill. Blake followed, ducking under a low ridge. They emerged into a hollow space carved naturally between 2 cliff faces. Blake dropped behind a boulder, catching his breath. Max didn't stop. He sprinted toward the far side of the hollow where a crooked pine tree marked the edge of a ledge. Blake knew what it was. The drop. It had been a test for him at 21. An old hiking trick known only to locals. From the cliff's edge, a narrow ledge led down to a hidden trail that twisted behind the ridge and back toward town. Dangerous. Barely legal. Perfect. Blake followed Max's lead, carefully placing each step. The slope was slick with moss and old rain. He glanced back movement above. One of the men had spotted them. They didn't shoot this time. They chased. 20 minutes later, Blake and Max emerged through a brush of thorn and gravel into a dried creek bed. Max turned, ears pinned back, and let out a deep, guttural bark. The men weren't following. Not anymore. They'd lost them. Blake collapsed onto a flat stone, chest heaving. Max stood guard a few feet away, nostrils flaring. Then he turned, walked over, and began pawing at Blake's backpack. He tugged at the zipper with his teeth. Blake raised an eyebrow. "What are you—" Then he remembered. The emergency kit, Camille's old wilderness pack. He opened it. Inside, rope, flares, a flashlight, and a sealed med bag. Max pushed his nose against the med bag, then lay down and held it in place with his paws, looking at Blake expectantly. Blake laughed, despite the pain. "You really are trained, aren't you?" He pulled out the gauze and antiseptic. His forearm was bleeding, a graze from bark or bullet, he wasn't sure. Max sat perfectly still, watching. Once cleaned and wrapped, Blake sat back. "That drop used to scare the hell out of me. I only made it once before. You knew where it was." Max tilted his head slightly. "You knew I'd follow." Max stood, moved closer, and gently nudged his nose into Blake's palm, a pact made in pine needles and sweat. As they trekked back along the edge of the creek, Blake spotted something half buried under a bush. He knelt. A small black recorder, waterproof, scuffed. He clicked play. A man's voice crackled through. Gruff, southern drawl. "We switched the brake lines. All he needs to do is panic at a turn. Ridge'll take care of the rest." Blake's blood ran cold. The recording was time-stamped. The morning before the crash. They hadn't just forged his name, they'd tried to kill him. At the Ashwood Ridge station, Nora Grant sat hunched over her computer. Her phone buzzed. A restricted number. She answered cautiously. "Deputy Grant." The voice on the other end was smooth, male, measured. "Ms. Grant, you don't know me. I'm with a federal oversight unit tied to municipal fraud investigation. I received your report." She straightened. "You're with DOJ?" "Let's just say we're adjacent," he replied. "I've seen enough to know you've got something real. But be careful. Ardent Group's not just paper and ink. They've got reach. Eyes in the State House. Possibly even your department. Why call me?" "Because you haven't been bought," the voice said, "and I need someone local who can keep her hands clean." Before she could respond, the line cut. Nora leaned back slowly. This wasn't just corruption. It was a war. The morning air was brittle with cold as Chief Blake drove out past the industrial edge of Ashwood Ridge, the town slowly giving way to weeds, rust, and broken promises. Max sat tall in the passenger seat, his breath fogging the window as he stared out, alert and expectant. They were following instinct now, Max's mostly. After the ambush in the forest and the voice recording about tampered brakes, Blake knew they couldn't wait for warrants or official channels. What they needed was buried, and Max seemed to know where to dig. The road ended at the edge of a chain-link fence, its gate twisted open and forgotten. Beyond lay the old county vehicle, graveyard acres of rusting cars, bent frames, and busted dreams. Once a municipal lot, it had been shut down years ago after a chemical spill from a nearby plant. The county had promised to clean it up. No one ever did. Max jumped out the moment the engine stopped. His gait was purposeful, tail low but steady, nose sweeping along the gravel path. Blake followed, eyes narrowed, the duffel bag with evidence still slung over his shoulder and the recording device in his coat pocket. They wandered between rows of skeletal cars. Max paused occasionally, ears twitching. Then, about 50 yards in, he stopped. A low growl rose in his throat. The vehicle in front of them was a black 2017 Lincoln Continental. The windshield was shattered. Moss crawled up the tires. Its registration plate was gone, but Blake recognized it. He crouched near the back bumper, brushing dirt away from a long scratch down the right side. He remembered seeing that mark in a photo taken a year ago, the last image of Elliot Crane, a local tax attorney who had tried to report misuse of town funds. He'd vanished after his car supposedly went off a mountain pass during a weekend trip. His body was never recovered. The wreck, they claimed, had been swept downriver. But here it was. Max circled to the trunk and barked sharply. Blake flinched. "Easy," he said. The trunk was slightly ajar. He moved to lift it, then froze. Max growled louder, standing rigid. Blake leaned closer and spotted a wire running from the latch into the frame panel. He backed away. "Trap," he whispered. Carefully, he removed his phone and snapped a few photos, then circled wide to examine the passenger side. The rear seat had been torn open, foam spilling out. Something glittered faintly in the mess. He reached in and pulled it free. A hard drive. Burnt along one edge but still intact. Someone had wrapped it in a heat-resistant pouch. He tucked it into the evidence bag. As he stood, something else caught his eye, a glint in the gravel near the front wheel. He bent down, brushed aside the dirt, and found a silver ring, dulled by time and weather. He held it up to the light. His initials were engraved on the inside. R.B. Blake's heart stuttered. It was his wedding band. He'd lost it 3 years ago during a house fire he helped extinguish near the western woods. The blaze was ruled accidental, but now it sat, dusty and hidden, beneath a car belonging to a man who'd tried to expose corruption. "This isn't a dump," he muttered. "It's a graveyard." Meanwhile, back in town, Deputy Nora Grant approached the side entrance of Ashwood Ridge's finance department. The building was an unimpressive one-story structure with faded beige siding and a flickering overhead light that buzzed like an annoyed insect. She wore plain clothes, dark jeans, a leather jacket, and a knitted gray beanie that masked her usual braid. Inside her shoulder bag was a compact camera and a small flashlight. She moved swiftly through the hallway, heading straight to the records room. The keypad still used the same outdated 4-digit code from 2 years ago. Nora had tested it earlier during a casual visit. 1967. The year Ashwood Ridge was founded. Inside the records room, rows of locked cabinets and filing drawers lined the walls. She found the drawer labeled Anonymous Accounts, 2022 to 2024, and pulled it open. Her hands moved fast, flipping through files. Most were small-town tax anomalies, missed payments, estate backlogs, but then she found it. An internal memo, marked confidential. Approved transfer of $125,000 from the Parks and Recreation Renovation Fund into an external holding account. Recipient: R. Blake. Routing ID: masked. Originating office: Office of Victor Hale. Nora's jaw tightened. She knew Blake had nothing to do with it, but someone had used his identity. She photographed everything and carefully returned the documents. As she exited the building, her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Again. She answered. The voice was the same as before. Calm, deliberate. "You're close." "I found a transfer to Blake," she said. "Fraudulent. Signed off by Hale." The voice was quiet a moment. "We've been monitoring Hale's associates. Be careful. One of them used to work in cybersecurity for state infrastructure. He can erase people from systems like they never existed. I want names. You'll get them. But first, make sure Blake knows he's not just being framed. He's being erased." Back at the junkyard, Blake and Max moved quickly back toward the cruiser. He didn't speak. His thoughts were spiraling, heavy with implications. Max trotted beside him, ears occasionally flicking back to check their rear. Just as they reached the car, Blake paused. "Good nose," he said quietly, placing a hand on Max's back. "Real good." Max's tail gave a single wag before stilling again. Blake opened the trunk and carefully stored the hard drive, wrapping it in a towel. He looked once more toward the rusted graveyard of steel behind him. Someone had gone through a lot of trouble to hide the past. Now he had pieces of it, and someone was going to burn for this. The community center had never seen a crowd this large. Rows of metal chairs filled the floor, and still people stood against the walls or leaned in from the open doorway. It wasn't the annual chili cook-off or 4th of July parade committee drawing them in this time. It was fear and anger and questions long ignored. Chief Raymond Blake stood at the podium, shoulders stiff beneath his brown uniform jacket. His wounds, both visible and beneath, hadn't fully healed, but his voice was steady. Max lay at his side, massive frame coiled and alert, eyes scanning the crowd with quiet purpose. Blake's eyes swept the room. "A week ago, I was almost killed on Highway 67. That's not speculation, it's confirmed sabotage. Someone tampered with my brakes. But that's not the only thing that's been tampered with." He reached into a leather folder and held up a blown-up copy of a forged land transfer agreement. "This document bears my signature. I never signed it. Someone has been selling pieces of Ashwood Ridge right out from under us, protected lands, historical sites, parks." Murmurs rippled across the room. In the front row, Councilwoman Sarah Devlin narrowed her eyes. Late 50s, with tightly coiled gray hair and a straight-backed posture, she was known in town for being both unshakably ethical and quietly intimidating. A former social worker who once rescued her own sister from an abusive marriage, Sarah had zero tolerance for corruption and an uncanny ability to detect lies. She leaned toward her neighbor, whispering something short and sharp. Blake continued, "I have evidence that these transactions are tied to shell companies. One of them, Ardent Group, has no office, no employees, no public record, yet they've received hundreds of thousands from our infrastructure budget. We've been bled dry from the inside." He didn't name Victor Hale directly, not yet, but everyone knew who handled the money. After the meeting ended, a small circle formed around Blake. Questions, handshakes, concerned voices. Max stood protectively at his side, flinching only when someone moved too fast. Most in town knew better than to reach for a working dog, especially one that looked like a bear with fangs. Later that night, the crowd had gone. Silence returned to the edges of Ashwood Ridge. Blake's cabin sat quiet on Miller's Hill, the windows dark except for the faint glow of the fireplace. Blake sat in his worn armchair, Max curled at his feet, when a sound snapped them both alert. A thud, then glass. Max was up in a blink, sprinting toward the kitchen. Blake grabbed the shotgun by the doorframe and moved low. A shadow darted across the window. A creak at the back step. Max let out a roar of a bark and hurled himself toward the door just as it began to open. A figure in black stumbled back, clearly not expecting 90 pounds of muscle and teeth to be greeting him. Blake threw the door open and shouted, "Freeze!" The man bolted into the woods. Blake didn't fire, but Max gave chase, barking into the night before returning minutes later, panting and unsatisfied. The next morning, local officers responded and began sweeping the property. One of them, Officer James Ellerby, a stocky, no-nonsense patrolman with a perpetual scowl and a thick North Dakota accent, was crouched near the fireplace when he called out, "Chief, you should see this." Blake knelt beside him. There, tucked just beneath a floorboard under the rug, was a small black device with a blinking red light. A listening device. Blake picked it up with gloved fingers, his face unreadable. "How long?" "Hard to say," Ellerby muttered. "Could have been weeks, could have been longer." Across town, Nora Grant had not slept. After receiving the federal agent's call, she'd spent hours rechecking archived emails and flagged communications. One file stood out, an unsigned PDF scanned from the mayor's office, dated only a few days before Blake's crash. It was a letter of resignation, citing medical instability and emotional exhaustion. Signed, Raymond Blake. Stamped for state approval. Nora scowled. The signature was precise. Too precise. She pulled up Blake's actual resignation from 2 years ago, never submitted. Written after Camille's death, but never used. The differences in tone were stark. The real one was raw. The fake, politely engineered. She printed both. That afternoon, Victor Hale held a surprise press conference outside Town Hall. He stood at the podium, flanked by 2 assistants in dark suits and a reporter from the local paper. His hair slicked, his smile polished, Hale looked every bit the polished politician, but his eyes twitched at the corners. "I'd like to address some recent concerns," he began, voice oozing calm. "While I admire Chief Blake's years of service, I must express my concern for his well-being. Following a series of erratic actions and considering recent medical incidents, I regretfully suggest that Chief Blake may no longer be in the best condition to lead our town's law enforcement." Gasps murmured through the crowd. Hale held up a document. This, his signed intent to retire, has been in motion for months. We are simply formalizing what he himself decided. Back at his cabin, Blake stood silently in front of the TV, watching the live broadcast. Max, sensing the shift in tension, pressed his head gently against Blake's thigh. "They want me gone," Blake whispered. "Not just from office, from history." The air inside Warehouse 9 was stale with disuse-rusted scaffolding, piles of unused pallets, and the cloying scent of mildew clinging to the rafters. It sat at the far edge of Ashwood Ridge's industrial zone, surrounded by skeletal fences and a row of half-dead trees that did little to shield it from the wind. From the outside, the place looked abandoned. From the inside, it was something else entirely, a carefully staged battlefield. Chief Raymond Blake stood near the center, his badge polished, His old uniform jacket zipped to the collar. There was no fear in his face, just resolve. Max stood by his side, shoulder tense, ears forward. His right flank had been shaved clean for stitching earlier that morning after the ambush at Blake's cabin. The wound still bled through faintly, but Max never once limped. He wouldn't, not while Blake was still in danger. Overhead, the lights buzzed back to life one by one, activated remotely. From a side door, Victor Hale entered with his usual theatrical grace. He wore a charcoal wool coat, pressed slacks, and gloves that looked better suited to a gala than a confrontation. Behind him, 2 men flanked his sides, hired security, not local PD. They moved with stiffness, hands near their belts. "Raymond," Hale said, smiling as he approached, "still playing sheriff in a town that's moved on." Blake's voice was low. "You left a lot of blood behind you, Hale." "Blood?" Hale chuckled. "No, I left progress. You're just too blind with nostalgia to see it." He walked slowly toward a makeshift table, pulling a sleek black laptop from a leather bag and setting it down. "I assume you've come to negotiate." Blake didn't answer. Hale opened the laptop and typed in a password. Ash67. Blake noted it silently, another piece for the file. The code was a reference to his crash. That wasn't just arrogance, it was a message. "Before you do anything reckless," Hale continued, "let me show you something." He turned the laptop to face Blake. A spreadsheet bloomed across the screen names, account numbers, amounts, payments, deposits, withdrawals, offshore entries, filtered through shell companies across 4 continents. "It's not just me," Hale said. "It never was." Blake didn't flinch. "Then you won't mind sharing the names." Hale's grin twitched. "Don't be naive." From the shadows above the loading dock, a red light blinked on. A body-length surveillance camera zoomed silently. Nearby, behind a set of crates, FBI Special Agent Celeste Rayner whispered into her comms. Tall, black, in her early 40s, Rayner was a field-hardened veteran with hawkish eyes and a tone that brokered no nonsense. She had worked high-profile public corruption cases from Baltimore to Sacramento. Nora had convinced her to come in person. "Subject has confessed to multi-jurisdiction laundering," Rayner whispered. Confirming with live feed and audio backup, team in position. Victor Hale turned to his men. "You see, Blake, you're a liability. You always were. That crash was supposed to be painless, quick, but then came your damn dog." Max let out a low growl, teeth barely visible. Blake remained silent, arms at his side, eyes locked on Hale's face. "You should have stayed retired," Hale added, lifting a small pistol from beneath his coat and aiming it directly at Blake. "Now you've got no escape." Max lunged. Everything happened in 2 seconds. The German Shepherd hurled forward, leaping across the concrete with a savage bark. Hale flinched and fired just as Max barreled into his arm. The bullet went wide, ricocheting off a steel beam. The impact sent both Max and Hale sprawling to the floor. Then came the shouting. "FBI! Weapons down!" Rayner and her team burst through the rear entrance, guns raised. The 2 security men froze, hands in the air. Haley groaned, trying to reach for the pistol again, but Rayner was already on him, boot pinning his wrist to the ground. "Don't," she said calmly. Max limped back toward Blake, blood soaking into his right side again, but he held his head high. "You okay?" Blake asked, kneeling beside him. Max thumped his tail once. "You did good, boy." Outside, police lights flooded the warehouse district. Hale was cuffed and escorted to an armored van. Agent Rayner approached Blake with a clipboard and a voice recorder. "You've got guts," she said. "We have enough on him to bring federal charges: embezzlement, fraud, attempted murder, obstruction. But this goes higher than him." "Names?" Blake asked. "They'll come, slowly, carefully. But for now, we're freezing every account tied to Hale or Ardent Group." Max sat down beside them, panting quietly, still bleeding, but calm. A young EMT named Tyler Zhang, a fresh-faced medic with quick hands and a gentle voice, knelt beside Max and began cleaning the wound. 26, recent graduate from Denver, Tyler had joined the local team for field trauma experience but had a soft spot for animals, especially ones that saved lives. "You've got a fighter here," Tyler said as he patched Max up. "This dog's more disciplined than half our department." Blake smiled faintly. "He's got better instincts than most politicians." From across the lot, Nora approached, jacket zipped up, a folder tucked beneath her arm. She looked more tired than usual, but her eyes shone with quiet fire. "He bought off 3 city council members," she said, handing Blake the folder. "We'll get them too." Blake glanced at the warehouse behind them. "Let's start with one monster at a time." The summer in Ashwood Ridge arrived like a whisper rather than a blaze. Cool breezes tangled in pine boughs, flowers returning shyly to window boxes, and warmth settling gently on the shoulders of a town that had finally exhaled. 6 months had passed since the arrest at Warehouse 9. 6 months since Victor Hale's empire of forged signatures and offshore accounts collapsed under its own rot. His trial was still underway in the city, but Ashwood Ridge had already begun its quiet rebuild. At the edge of the town, where the land sloped upward into fir-covered hills, stood a new wooden building with large glass windows and a sign carved by hand. Max's Ridge, Canine Rescue and Training Center. The lettering was bold, clean, and framed by the silhouette of a German shepherd mid-leap. Retired Chief Raymond Blake stood near the training field, a coffee mug in one hand, the other resting on Max's thick fur. The old shepherd sat beside him, posture as alert as ever, despite the silver hairs now weaving into his muzzle. His right shoulder bore a faint scar beneath the fur healed, but always present. Max had not slowed, not truly. He still woke with the sunrise, paced the perimeter of the center's fence, and greeted every new recruit canine or human with the measured gaze of a veteran who had seen too much to be easily impressed. Blake wore a flannel shirt tucked into old work jeans. His beard was fuller now, tinged with gray. Retirement suited him, not because he'd stopped fighting, but because he had finally chosen the battlefield. Nora Grant emerged from the admin office wearing her new uniform, now stitched with a silver star. Sheriff Grant. The promotion came quietly, without fanfare, but the community knew. She carried herself with calm assurance, her eyes sharper than ever. In her hands was a clipboard, but she paused when she spotted Blake. "You're up early," she said, smirking. "I was never good at sleeping in," Blake replied. "Besides, someone's got to make sure Max doesn't start running the place." Max huffed in response, resting his head briefly against Blake's leg before trotting off to greet the morning trainees. Across the field, a group of teenagers in matching gray hoodies gathered near the obstacle course. Among them stood Elijah Monroe, a 17-year-old with sandy blonde hair, wiry frame, and haunted eyes that had once held nothing but shadows. 6 months ago, he'd been admitted to juvenile probation for repeated truancy and isolation, diagnosed with depression after the loss of his older brother in a highway accident. A court-mandated program brought him to Max's Ridge. Now, he stood with a rope leash looped confidently around his shoulder, a young Labrador mix at his heel, and a calm in his body that hadn't existed before. Max approached him slowly, sniffing the air. Elijah lowered himself, offering a palm. Max licked it once. Blake watched from the distance, his chest tightening with something he didn't often allow: hope. Later that afternoon, the town square buzzed with quiet excitement. People gathered under canvas awnings and beside flower planters, their eyes turned toward the newly unveiled bronze statue. It stood in the center of Ashwood Ridge's main plaza, a life-sized rendering of Max, seated tall, ears alert, beside a standing figure of Blake in uniform. The plaque read, "To Max and Chief Raymond Blake, for loyalty that saved a town." Sarah Devlin stood near the front of the crowd, hands clasped tightly. Her usually stern face shimmered with emotion. She'd been instrumental in pushing the town council to approve the statue, saying, "A community needs more than laws. It needs legends." As the sun dipped low behind the courthouse steeple, Blake stepped forward to speak. "I've served Ashwood Ridge nearly 3 decades," he began. "I've seen its best days and its worst. But when I think of the night that changed everything, when I was pulled from fire and darkness by a creature with no badge, no oath, what I remember most was not fear. It was purpose. He paused, turning toward Max, who sat near the base of the statue, head tilted just slightly. "This dog," Blake said, his voice quiet but strong, "is my last partner, my final shield, my last howl in the dark. And I don't say this lightly, Max. You saved more than my life. You gave it back." A ripple of applause broke across the plaza. Someone wiped away tears. A child in the crowd whispered, "That's the hero dog." That night, the center lights dimmed early. Elijah stayed late to help clean up after the training session, brushing the pups and folding equipment. As he stepped outside, he found Max curled near the wooden porch, eyes closed, paws crossed. Blake stood beside him, arms crossed, looking out toward the stars. "Elijah," he said, "you handled yourself well today." The teen shrugged, smiling faintly. "He makes it easier." Blake nodded. "Max has that effect." They stood in silence for a while before Elijah asked, "Do you think he still sees danger everywhere?" "No," Blake said, "but I think he still believes the world is worth watching over." The moon rose high, casting silver lines across the fields. Max opened one eye, then closed it again, satisfied. He would sleep on the porch, as he always did, because even in peace, a true guardian never quite lets go. Sometimes God doesn't send miracles wrapped in light from the heavens. Sometimes he sends them on 4 legs, with scars on their side and eyes that still believe the world is worth protecting. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a vessel of grace. A quiet reminder that loyalty, courage, and redemption often come when we least expect them. And Chief Blake, he learned that even in the ashes of loss, God can light a new fire, one fueled by purpose, by faith, and by love that never gives up. In our everyday lives, we may not be saving towns or uncovering dark conspiracies, but we all face battles, invisible ones, lonely ones. And sometimes what saves us isn't a grand gesture. It's a quiet presence, a second chance, a loyal heart. So, if you believe that miracles still walk among us, whether through people, through animals, or through the gentle whisper of God's mercy, leave a comment below and write one simple word: Amen. And if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who might need a reminder that light always finds a way in. Subscribe for more stories that celebrate faith, loyalty, and the small wonders that change everything. May God bless you and those you love. May He send you a Max when you need him most.
The lake had never been still, not truly. Even in its quietest moods, there was always some small movement beneath the surface. The ripple of carp turning in shadow, the long glide of a water snake crossing the reeds, the slow breath of the cattails nodding in shallow rhythm. But that morning, it was the silence that unsettled the locals most. Not the usual kind, not the hushed stillness of mist or early dawn, but a strange, holding silence, like something had just passed through and taken all the noise with it. Emmett Gardner stood ankle-deep at the shoreline, his boots wet and laces crusted with algae. He had been coming to this lake every morning for 32 years, first as a game warden, now as something more uncertain. He no longer carried the badge, but habits had their own inertia. Same thermos, same path through the pine fringe, same old metal bench that creaked when he leaned to lace up his waders. But this morning, he hadn't sat, he hadn't even his coffee. He was frozen, eyes pinned to the dog. It had leapt from the dock without a sound, no bark, no pause. 1 second it had been still beside him, its ears twitching at the lake's surface. The next, it was gone, legs stretched, water breaking around its chest. It wasn't Emmett's dog. That much he had clarified weeks ago, when it started following him along the trail from the northern trailhead. Just a mutt, broad-shouldered and sandy, with pale eyes that made people uncomfortable. No collar, number, tags Pettit had taken to him, and despite the town's murmurs, the ones that said Emmett should keep to himself, that he should let the past stay buried, the dog had come anyway. He didn't call out, not when it jumped, not even when it dove again. Gone entirely now, nothing visible except the tremble of rings where the splash had been. The lake swallowed movement too quickly, always had, just as it had swallowed other things before kayaks. Rowboats a boy once, long ago, on a warm October day no one in Dry Creek ever talked about. From the dock, Emmett took 2 steps forward, the boards groaning beneath his weight, then silence again. Minutes passed, long ones dotting town. Church bells were ringing faintly, though the sound barely reached this far out. Emmett could smell cedar smoke, likely from Walt Jenkins' chimney on the ridge. But here, by the water, everything was still, even the wind through. The spruce seemed to hesitate. Then the water broke. At first he thought it was the dog again, but the shape was wrong. He narrowed his eyes. It was still the dog, yes, but not alone. Its head angled up, jaw clenched onto something soft and slick, something heavy. The dog kicked hard, dragging it toward shore with jerking, muscular effort. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't wood. Emmett stepped into the lake without thinking, boots flooding instantly, cold numbing his shins. He met the dog, needy hands reaching out. It was a coat. No, not just a coat. A child's coat, pink, waterlogged, still zipped inside it. Something small, limp. Emmett fell to his knees before he realized he was falling. The dog released its grip and stepped back, panting, its eyes fixed not on the man but on the trees beyond. It didn't wag, it didn't whine, it simply waited. The girl was no older than 7, curled as if in sleep. Her hair clung to her cheeks like ribbons of lakeweed. Her face was pale but not blue, not yet. Emmett tore open the zipper with fingers. That didn't feel like his. No marks, no bruising. The breath in her chest flickered, faint, shallow, but real, alive. He looked up, but the dog was already gone, trotting away from the shore, head low, tail stiff, not toward town, away from it, north, into the woods. And Emmett, who had once sworn never to follow another trail, without knowing where it led, found himself rising to his feet, lifting the girl gently into his arms, and watching the animal disappear into the trees. By the time sirens began to wail faintly in the distance, someone must have seen, someone must have seen, someone must have called. He was no longer thinking of the child. Not entirely. He was thinking of the way the dog had paused on the dock before it jumped, the way it had stared into the lake as if something had called it from beneath. As if it knew. And behind that thought, a second one stirred, quieter, older, more dangerous, because the last time something like this had happened, it hadn't been a rescue. It had been a warning. Emmett didn't speak when the ambulance doors closed behind them. The girl had been lifted gently from his arms by a paramedic in orange, her lashes trembling faintly as if trying to open from some half-dream. They hadn't asked him questions, not yet. Maybe it was the badge that still hung from the chain around his rearview mirror, or the look in his eyes. Either way, they had simply nodded, taken the child, and left the lake behind in a flurry of wet boots and quiet efficiency. Now the shoreline was empty again. Only the wind remained, whispering low across the water like it was trying to remember something. The dock creaked, the wood dry and splitting at the edges, and Emmett felt the cold again. Not in his feet. He'd peeled the wet boots and socks off back at his truck, but deeper, somewhere just behind the breastbone where his breath had started to slow but not yet steady. The dog was gone, but its trail remained faint, paw prints pressed into the muddy incline. Disappearing into the tree line, he followed without thinking, not because he expected answers, but because something inside him couldn't not follow. The kind of knowing that settles in a man's bones after too many years spent watching the patterns of weather. The way deer scatter before lightning, the way crows go silent before a body is found. The trail was strange. It didn't weave like an animal foraging, and it didn't veer off into thickets like a dog chasing scent. It moved straight, purposeful, as if it knew exactly where it was going, and what was waiting there. 20 minutes into the woods, Emmett paused. The light had begun to change, gold warming to amber, then thinning to pale ash as the trees thickened. Sunlight struggled through the canopy, laying soft broken lines across the forest floor. His breath made little clouds, barely visible, but persistent. And beneath it all he began to notice something else. Silence, not the kind that comes with stillness. This was different. There were no bird calls, no rustle of underbrush. Even the squirrels, normally loud, careless little things, had vanished. Emmett knelt near a mossy rise and touched the soil. Still damp, no scat, no broken branches, just the trail, just the dog. And then something, a sound, distant, metallic. He turned his head slightly, not a clang, not loud, but deliberate, like a gate swinging shut somewhere far beyond the trees. A second passed, then another. Nothing followed. He rose and kept walking. By the time he saw the cabin, dusk had begun to settle like a breath exhaled from the earth itself. Not darkness yet, but the promise of it. The structure was old, slumped at one end like the foundation had surrendered to frost long ago. Emmett remembered it vaguely. The Jensen place. Abandoned for over a decade now. Some family tragedy had folded it into local memory as a place best left alone. The roof was gone in parts. The porch sagged, but the front door still stood. Opened out, the trail ended here. And so had the dog's prints. He stepped forward, each movement quiet, measured. The smell hit first damp wood, old mold, and something else. Faint, but strange, like burnt sugar and rust. Inside, the light pooled in soft patches where holes in the roof let dusk filter through. Dust floated in slow spirals, disturbed only by his breath. And there, in the center of the room, was a blanket, curled into a shape. Another child, smaller than the first. This one awake. Eyes open wide, glassy, unblinking. Emmett didn't speak. He approached slowly, crouched off the child, didn't move, just stared past him toward something behind. Emmett turned. There, in the shadows near what had once been the kitchen, stood the dog. Silent, its eyes met his. Unblinking, not aggressive but not soft either. And behind it, the faintest sound of something moving. Not another dog, not a person. Something dragging. Emmett's hand drifted to his belt out of habit, but there was nothing there. He hadn't carried a weapon in years, only a pocket knife, and it didn't feel like a day for knives. The child began to hum, a low, tuneless sound, rhythmic and distant, as if repeating something half. The dog took a step forward, not toward the child, but between Emmett and whatever moved in the dark. Its body lowered slightly. Protective. There was more to this than a rescue, more than instinct. Emmett understood that now. He stepped back, eyes flicking to the window, and then he heard it beneath the dragging sound, a whisper. His name, not shouted, not loud but unmistakable. The kind of voice you only hear when something knows you deeply and hasn't forgotten. The sound of the sirens faded into the forest like smoke, thin, unreal, and quickly gone. Emmett didn't move. The girl lay wrapped in his old canvas jacket, her breaths still shallow but steady. Paramedics had arrived minutes ago, soft-spoken and slow-moving, as if afraid sound might undo what luck had preserved. One of them had asked Emmett his name. He didn't answer. He was still watching the tree line. The dog had vanished, not hurried, not frantic, just gone. The pine needles underfoot were still trembling. A late morning wind had picked up, shifting through the upper branches with a restless hush, and for the first time since the dog had appeared at his side weeks ago, Emmett felt its absence like a hole in the world. He stood just off the trail now, away from the responders. Someone had taken the girl in a thermal blanket to the ambulance that waited just down the old access road. No questions had been asked yet, no names, but they'd come soon. They always did. Behind him, the lake was already smoothing over as if none of it had happened, as if no dog had jumped, as if no child had been pulled from beneath the surface. He stared into the woods, and something inside him stirred, something old and familiar, not quite memory, more like instinct. He stepped off the trail. The pine forest ran deep here, deeper than most remembered. The understory was patchy moss, old ferns, and the occasional blood-red scatter of mountain ashberries crushed under hoof or paw. The air was damp, rich with the earthy scent of decaying bark and cold soil. It pulled at a part of him that had stayed buried for years. Every few paces, Emmett stopped, listened. Once, a hawk called out, high above, sharp and metallic. Another time he thought he heard movement, brush shifting, something weighty stepping away, but when he reached the old split log near the creek bend, there was no sign, just a broken trail of wet paw prints. Fresh, he crouched low beside them, deep indentations, heavy, confident steps. The dog had gone this way, and not in a panic. It had moved with purpose, almost like it knew where to go. Emmett's hand brushed the dirt beside the tracks. It was cold, still damp from the lake. He could smell the water clinging to the soil. And just then, a memory came back, unwanted but clear. A different day, a different year, a different child. Don't think about it. He stood up. The forest darkened slightly as a cloud passed overhead, softening the sun to a pale haze. The light here always seemed older, like it filtered through time as well as trees. Emmett followed the trail further north, toward the edge of the wetlands, an area once marked off years ago during a missing persons search. A place with history. But this time, something had changed. Along the trail, just before the cattail beds opened into the shallow basin, he found it, a torn piece of denim, small faded pink embroidery at the seam. He lifted it carefully. It was stiff, dried at the edges, old, not from today. And it wasn't alone. A few feet farther, half buried beneath moss and twigs, a rusted thermos glinted dully. Emmett blinked. He knew that thermos had held it, had handed it to a father whose voice broke when he said he just wanted to keep her warm. He crouched slowly, hands tightening against his knees. A hush had fallen over the woods again, that strange held breath quiet. No birds, no wind, and then movement, not loud, just a soft padding, then a pause. From the corner of his eye, Emmett saw it, the dog, standing between two trees, half-shadowed, watching him. But there was something different in its posture now. Head low, but not submissive. Eyes alert, not wild. It didn't wag its tail. It didn't move closer. It waited. Emmett rose. He didn't speak. He didn't dare. The dog stepped aside, not back into the forest, but deeper into the basin toward a spot Emmett hadn't approached in years. The overgrowth was thicker here. No clear trail, but the dog walked with certainty, threading through bramble and fallen logs with the grace of something that belonged. Emmett followed, and with every step, that old knot in his chest tightened. He didn't know what he was walking toward, not yet, but something in the quiet held meaning, the kind that only time and loss could recognize. By the time the dog stopped again, beside a moss-covered boulder shaped like a cradle, the wind had stilled entirely. The air pressed close, thick with memory. The dog turned to look at him once more, then sat, waiting. Emmett stared at the stone. Then slowly, he knelt, not in fear, not in reverence, but in understanding. because buried in the ground beneath him, he could just make out the edge of something worn by water and time, a child's sandal, faded, small, out of place. His breath caught, not from fear, from recognition. Emmett didn't move for a long time. The girl's breath came in uneven threads against his collar, warm and wet, as though her lungs still couldn't decide whether they trusted the world enough to try again. His arms, once strong and sure from years of lifting half-conscious hikers out of ravines or dragging lost calves from marshes, now trembled under her light weight, not from effort, from something else, something older. The dog was gone. The woods had swallowed it, not even the underbrush rustling in its wake. The sirens that had started in the distance never arrived. They faded as they had come, as though whatever help they'd promised had taken a wrong turn, or thought better of coming. So he walked, not back toward town. Not yet. He cradled the child close, her coat dripping against his hip, and made his way up the rise behind the lake. The old ranger path now little more than a memory overtaken by roots, moss, the slow patience of disuse. With each step, the forest grew quieter, thicker, the air cooled. Somewhere a woodpecker rattled high in the pines, but otherwise the world offered no explanation. That stillness, it wasn't peace, it was waiting. Halfway up the ridge, Emmett stopped. The girl stirred faintly. A single pine cone fell and bounced once against the earth, startling them both. He lowered her carefully to a patch of dry needles beneath a cedar, stripped off his overshirt and wrapped it around her shoulders. She moaned, turned her face slightly, and fell still again. He crouched beside her, watching, waiting. He should have gone for help. He knew that. Should have run with her to town, found someone with a radio, an ambulance, anything, but something had shifted. Not just in the water, not just in him. The dog had led him here, not by demand, not by leash or voice, but by something quieter. A nudge of instinct, an old memory awakening. The last time he'd ignored it, a boy had gone missing. A shadow passed overhead. He looked up. A hawk, circling slowly. Emmett followed its arc and noticed it, a clearing half hidden behind a tangle of wind-fallen branches. He lifted the girl again, lighter now somehow, as if the decision to keep going had removed a weight he hadn't named yet. The clearing was ringed with stones, not natural ones placed, old worn moss. At the center, a stump charred beside it, a rusted shovel embedded deep in the soil. And around the edges, tucked into roots and hollows, were small things, children's things. A cracked teacup, a torn shoe, a waterlogged backpack with a frayed patch in the shape of a horse, trinkets too ruined to mean anything unless you knew what they were, or who they had belonged to. Emmett stood at the edge, unsure whether to enter. The dog had come this way. He could feel it. That same quiet pressure at the back of his mind. Not pushing, inviting, he took one step forward, then another. A twig snapped in the trees behind him. He turned sharply. Nothing, no movement, but the air had changed. He could feel it in the tightness of the bark, in the way the wind pressed unevenly now, shoving instead of gliding. He looked down at the girl. Her eyes were open. Not wide, not startled, just open, and looking past him. Toward the stump, toward something only she could see. He turned back, slow, and saw the dog. It stood by the far tree line, chest heaving, fur slicked and darker now, as if it had passed through something wet or old, mud maybe, or blood. It didn't move, just watched, but it wasn't alone. Behind it, half in shadow, stood a second figure, taller, upright, human in shape, barely visible through the fog that had begun to slide in from the marshes, a coat, long hands at the sides. No face he could make out. But there was no fear, not in the dog, not in the girl, only him. The figure stepped forward once, and stopped. Then it raised a hand, slow, deliberate, not a threat, a signal. Emmett stepped back without thinking. His boot struck something, one of the stones. It tipped, fell, and cracked in half. The air split with it. The girl screamed, not in pain, in recognition. And from somewhere deep beneath the clearing, something answered, not a voice, not a growl, a sound like breath through hollow bone, old, rising. The figure turned, and was gone. And the dog. It stayed, waiting. The scream faded into the trees, swallowed by the hush that followed. Not silence, but something deeper. A hush that lived between breaths, between words unspoken. The girl didn't cry. She simply leaned into Emmett's shoulder, small fingers curling into the fabric of his shirt as if anchoring herself to the world. He didn't speak either. Not when the wind picked up. Not when the fog thinned just enough to reveal that the figure was truly gone, leaving behind no imprint in the soft pine loam. Only the dog remained, still and watchful. That it moved first. Stepping into the clearing, it approached the stump, circled once, and sat, not alert, not guarding, just waiting. Emmett followed with the girl in his arms, unsure of what drew him forward. It was instinct again. The same thread that had pulled him toward the lake, then up the ridge. The same thread that had led him here, where truth waited not in the open, but in the quiet. At the base of the stump, just beneath the loose bark, lay a small silver pendant, weathered but intact, a child's name etched into it. Mara. The girl looked at it, said nothing. She didn't need to. Emmett lowered her gently beside it, and she reached out, brushing the charm with her fingertips. For a moment the air felt warmer, lighter. The breeze moved through the trees like an exhale. Then the dog rose. It came to her side, sniffed her once forehead to forehead, then turned away. No urgency, no pause. It stepped past Emmett, without a sound, nose low to the ground, tail steady. As it crossed the edge of the clearing, it looked back once, not at the girl, at him. And in that glance, Emmett understood. It hadn't been the girl it was following all this time. It had been the wound in him, the unfinished road, the echo of the boy he couldn't save all those years ago. The dog had known, somehow, and now its work was done. By the time the medics arrived, Emmett had already gathered the trinkets from the clearing, gently placing them in his old ranger's pack. The girl slept against his chest, her breath steadier now, her body lighter in his arms. As the stretcher rolled down the hill, and the others gathered to ask questions he had no desire to answer, Emmett turned once more toward the trees. The dog was gone, but on the edge of the path, where moss met gravel, a single paw print remained, pressed deep, as if reminding him that some journeys end not with answers, but with the quiet permission to forgive. He stood there a long while, until the wind shifted and dusk began to settle, across the lake once more. Then he followed the trail back down, not to return to who he had been, but to become someone who could remember without regret.